Hello, and welcome to the second unit, which is really the first unit that we're dealing with the book and the content of Western civilization. So I just wanted to give you some kind of a broad picture, brief and broad picture of the main topics that you're going to be reading about and talking about. So, your book starts out with just talking a little bit about Western civilization and what it means, or what does the West mean, right? And they explain that the term comes from ancient Greece when the Greeks saw themselves as the center of the world as they understood it. There was Persia to the east of them, and Italy and other parts of the Mediterranean to the west of them. And the Romans kind of felt the same way, though they expanded their borders just a little bit. And today, we think of it, we tend to think of it as Europe, obviously, but also what we call the Middle or Near East, the Mediterranean region, that sort of thing. And then in this part of Western Civ, we get into the Americas as well. And so the Americas become part of the West, and that's set off against the east, the Asia, and there were explorations going on in there. So this class really starts with the early modern period. And your book also points out that in the pre-modern period, the most crucial development was the Renaissance, in part because it ended the long period of the Middle Ages that lasted about 1,000 years from the time that the Roman Empire in the West fell to the Renaissance, and the Renaissance ushered in the early modern period, and it renewed or introduced or reintroduced ideas of education, that opened up the West to the development of new ideas. But it was also because it was increased mobility. People were moving around a lot, and the exploration is an important part of what shapes this period of time. So here are some of the important topics. The religious wars that were brought about by the Protestant Reformation are just kind of ending at the beginning of this period. People had a hard time with this idea that they could live side by side with people that weren't of their same religion. And this is really following about 1,500 years in which Christianity meant the Catholic Church in Europe, or the Greek Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe. And those were very similar and came out of the same church. Judaism and Islam were still considered to be outsiders. And in fact, of course, in the Iberian Peninsula, they were enemies, basically, especially the Islamic kingdoms. But the Islamic kingdoms were also trying to encroach on the Ottoman Empire and even the Holy Roman Empire. And, so there's just a lot of tension there. And we also have in this period of time what we call the Little Ice Age, and that brought about lower crop yields, crop failures, social and political instabilities, famines, that sort of thing. And that ends with the rise of industrialization when we started burning a lot of coal, and that was really the beginning, right, of this climate change, this global warming, as we used to call it, right. The Little Ice Age lasted until the end of the 14th century through the beginning of the 17th century. Another topic is the fragmenting of the Spanish Empire in Europe. And we'll see even more of that. But this beginning part talks about things that are happening with the Netherlands and stuff like that. And one thing to remember, there's a lot of wars. Okay, I have a lot of wars as one of my topics, right? Because there were a lot of wars, especially between England and Spain and France, but not just them. And also the Holy Roman Empire, which are the Germanic states. There was no unified Germany yet. There was no unified Italy. The Holy Roman Empire went down into the Italian peninsula, but then the Spanish Empire had Naples, and so the map of Europe is very different. The 30 Years' War, which kind of always marks the transition between Western Civ 1 and Western Civ 2, was very important. It was fought mainly in the German states in the Holy Roman Empire, and they suffered a lot. The big loser in that war was Spain, and the winners were France and also Sweden. In the middle of this war, Britain had a civil war, so they had to drop out of the war and go back to tending to things at home. And the 30 Years' War is generally considered to be the last war about religion and the first one about nationalism. Okay, absolutism. Two forms of government came about in this period that you're going to be reading about: absolutism and constitutionalism. So absolutism, is the idea that the king should have absolute power, and it's connected to divine right, or God made my family special, and that's why we have this right to rule, and we should have absolute power. And this came about in large part because they were the kings, the monarchs, they were mostly kings, were trying to reconsolidate the power that they had given up during the Middle Ages. Louis XIV of France is considered to be the best example of an absolute ruler. No one, even Louis XIV, completely achieved absolute power. But other examples include Austria, Prussia, Spain, Russia. They were all attempting to do that. And in fact, so did England. But, I'll talk about that in a minute. That didn't work very well there. So what were the effects of absolutism? Larger, more professional armies, frequent wars, and frequent wars is a recurring theme, economic stress because of the cost of these two things, and the brunt of the taxation fell on the peasants, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. And then the other form of government is constitutionalism, and it's exemplified by England and the Dutch Republic. It was a form of representative government, but limited compared to how we think about it today. So the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution that followed it, which I mentioned the war before. So when Charles I of England tried to emulate Louis XIII and his son Louis XIV and claim absolute power, Parliament said, no, wait a minute. And Parliament didn't meet regularly then, but he was in a uprising. He was facing an uprising in Scotland. So he needed money. So he called Parliament back into session. And they said, no, absolutely not. So Oliver Cromwell, who you've probably heard about, united forces into what he called, or what's now called, the New Model Army. It was a paid fighting force. And rather than having to scrounge for or plunder for supplies, they actually supplied them. Charles I was executed, and the country was ruled for a while by Cromwell as the Lord Protector. After Cromwell died, and he wanted his son to take over for him, but that didn't happen. His son was kind of inept. So Charles's son took the throne. And then he was followed when he died by his brother James II, who was from Scotland and was Catholic, and that worried everybody because we had the Anglican Church, and the king was the head of the Anglican Church, and all that stuff. So a group of English lawmakers invited William of Orange, and he's from the Netherlands, to lead a force against James and claim the throne. He was married to James's daughter Mary, who was Protestant. There was some multiple marriages and stuff like that going on in there. But anyway, so they did. And then when they were appointed as co-rulers, they agreed to abide by a new act called the Bill of Rights, which stated that the monarchs were also subject to the law, because that was a big sticking point with Parliament. And that basically established the first constitutional monarchy. Now, the Dutch Republic is the other one that we always point to, and there's some videos, lectures about that, if you can, bear to listen to them. But it looked different from England. They didn't really have, they had rulers, but they had stateholders is what they had. So they had it was an assembly of states. But the effects of constitutionalism really didn't look all that much different than absolutism. Again, growth of professional armies because they were all fighting wars, and the taxes fell on the common people. So the other thing, it's not the last thing on my list, but another thing was early capitalism. So before that, we had mercantilism, and mercantilism is this idea that there is a set, limited amount of wealth in the world, and the only way that I get richer is to take it away from somebody else. And now we've gotten into the age of exploration and colonialism and setting up colonies. And Spain was bringing back, tons of gold and silver and precious metals from their and precious gems from their colonies, and yet they went bankrupt. And so and at the same time, these companies like the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company were kind of the de facto governments in India and in the the Dutch Asian territories, and basically they were getting rich. And so we start to see the very beginnings of capitalism. And capitalism is the system that says economic activities. In this case, it was trade, but later becomes manufacturing. These economic activities generate wealth. It's not that this certain amount of gold and silver and whatever. It's actually what you do with your investments. Okay. So anyway, we see the beginnings of early capitalism, and obviously along with that, overseas expansion. So your book has a really interesting um, uh, statistic. By 1800, 35% of the globe was controlled either directly or indirectly by European powers. That includes the Americas, China, Japan, Philippines, India, places like that. There were only very small colonies on the African coast and not, in the continent itself. And these were mostly related to the slave trade. So I mentioned the Dutch Republic. They were leaders in commerce and trade, and they established the first stock market, and they also had the first stock market crash with the tulip disaster because they were selling futures of tulips, and that didn't work. Okay, another important topic is the African slave trade. Sugar was an important driver of that because it was the most profitable colonial product, but there were others. Okay, and all of these were very labor intensive, and they couldn't rely on the Native Americans, the natives here, because they were dying in huge numbers from the diseases that were brought over from Europe, for which they had no immunities. Africa had more immunities because they had been in contact with Europeans for a long time. So they turned to Africa for slaves. Most of the slaves went to the Caribbean or Brazil, other parts of Latin America, Mexico, other parts of the Caribbean, and the United States, of course. But in reality, the United States was probably about 10% of the total slaves that were brought over. They were just, there were just, the estimates are somewhere between 7 and 9 million, I think. So a lot. This was part of this triangle trade that was set up between Africa, the Americas, and Europe. And this triangle trade essentially created what we call the Columbian Exchange, which is an exchange of people, goods, food, all kinds of things. So, the societies in the Americas became more of a blend: African food, European food, indigenous food. But that was also true in Europe too, because they really liked the things that were coming from the Americas, like potatoes, chocolate. Who wouldn't, right? Sugar to go with that chocolate, right? But spices from the old world. So there was just this huge mixing, and this is really when we really get to be a global economy and a globe. All the globes now know about each other, right? And the big areas of colonization were India, parts of Asia, other parts of Asia, and the Americas. So anyway, that's what I have. I'm sorry I talked so long. I tried to keep it short. But if you have any questions, please let me know. This is the beginning, the first unit of all of your normal assignments that are going to be recurring throughout the rest of the semester. So if you have questions, now is the time to ask them. Otherwise, I look forward to reading your thoughts about the readings and your other assignments. So anyway, thanks for getting this far.